Wake up! Wake up, wake up, wake up! Up you wake, up you wake, up you wake, up you wake!
Of culture that's underneath the apparent superficial diversity, the apparent diversity that is very superficial. What is really important is the cultural deep structure, and we could go on and on about that, but that is really a key point. And it's not only true on the continent of Africa, it's true of African people wherever they are, including in the Western diaspora, including in the United States of America.
These two dances developed at two different times in two different continents.
That's why culture becomes very important. That's why people cannot tell us that culture, you know, is something that, I mean, it's important, but don't worry about it. It is important. Because if our children are to succeed, they have got to have a positive sense of who they are, who they have been, so that they will know what they can be.
People used to think of culture as, say, the spirit of a society, the basic ideas and symbols and things of that sort. Okay, that is one sort of standard intellectual view of culture. Second view of culture, especially pushed by the anthropologists, was a little bit broader and basically thinks of culture as the way of life of a people, which includes their material objects, their arts, but also their customs. So that's a very mixed bag.
After this, your first question is, what is culture, or what is a working definition of culture? For the purposes of this segment of African American Culture, a second look, let's just call culture whatever you can learn.
In this edition of our 10-part series, we're going to examine the assumptions most of us make about culture. Can a people deprived of native language and forced to shed traditional lifestyles retain any vestige of their original heritage? Traditional scientific research says no, and they point to what they see as an absolute separation between black Americans and traditional African culture. But there's a volume of information to dispute those claims. The black fraternity step routines you just saw clearly mimic traditional South African boot dances. While this example may seem like a coincidence to some, California psychologist Dr. Wade Noble says it's one of many instances where blacks in America have kept or tapped into their African roots almost subconsciously.
Because culture is a mental process, and what happened in our trek to the New World is that we were prohibited from engaging in certain behavioral practices, but the psychology or the mentality of African people never was destroyed. It, in fact, part of the intellectual theoretical community tries to talk about the transmission of information, likes to talk about information be transmitted overtly and intentionally from one generation to the next. Where in the African tradition, you have to evaluate people from their cultural spirit or space.
For the last 200 years, traditional historians had two premises about African American culture. First, most history and sociology books teach us slavery destroyed all cultural ties black Americans had to Africa. Most historians would also have us believe that African culture existed in an uncivilized and undeveloped environment before the Europeans came. Both tenets of traditional wisdom are wrong. In the next half hour, we'll show you sophisticated pre-European African cultures which had wealth, respect, writing, commerce, and governments organizing the lives of millions of people. To contradict the theory black Americans lost all African culture as slaves, we'll examine linguistic, social, and musical research from Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker, and Dr. Asa Hilliard. One of the most obvious areas to see black Americans' ties to Africa comes from linguistics. If we compare Black American dialect with some dominant West African languages, we see an amazing amount of often overlooked cultural continuity.
And we know that when African people were brought to this country, we were not sat down in a classroom at Atlanta University and taught how to speak the King's English. We had to pick it up as we could pick it up. And so we have African people taking in this new language, this English language, and adapting it to the way that they spoke, their traditional ways of speaking.
FT, ST, SK, LD, and the suffix ING. In the English language, these consonant clusters are distributed. In West African language, they are not. Therefore, in African American languages, words like drift, swift, and left will be drift, swift, and left.
But as more Black American scholars begin to see similarities, more of the ties to African culture start to fit. Some of them seem very obvious, as Ebonics specialist Dr. Ernie Smith explained during this 1979 PBS interview in San Diego.
Relexification is a process of acquiring or restructuring a language. In the case of the English language, we have an example here of some languages having a verb system that is aspectual and some having a tense system. In this particular case, we have the Latin ego amo tu, which the English equivalent would be I love you, but the verb order, subject, verb, object, is not Latin. So relexification has occurred for African speech in that you won't find a copula verb. She, gone. We don't have a verb to expressly predicate present tense. He, they, mine. Whose are these? They, mine. There's no verb to be.
No possessive state.
No possessive or copula verb, as they're called in linguistics.
In 1979, when few people knew about Ebonics, the study of African American speech, in 1989, Black scholars have moved forward from the richness and wisdom of African oral traditions. Now they've started to dismiss the calculated inaccuracies spread about the intelligence of African slaves. Most of us have learned those slaves came to the New World unable to write. That's not true. They may not have known how to speak or write English, but many spoke several languages and knew how to write in their native tongues.
If you saw a people's writing and you were told that they had no writing, you would call it decoration. If you saw Chinese being written and you did not know this was a formal language, you would indeed say, oh, they do good decoration.
What proof do we have to support these claims? Well, the writings themselves.
Well, let me just show you Nsibidi, Mende, the Moom script from the Cameroons, the Vi script from Liberia, and the Bete script from the Ivory Coast. And it's important to expose students to all these different writing systems, because that destroys the myth that African people had no systems of writing, that African people did not write. It's a myth. It's a lie.
Mrs. Harris wrote the essay on literature for Portland, Oregon's groundbreaking research on African studies. You can read part of that research in the Portland Baseline Essays. This project took almost a decade to develop and now used by Atlanta schools in their infusion program. During her research on writing, Mrs. Harris looked at Black Americans' cultural linguistic ties to West Africa. But while doing that research, she discovered possible ties the writing in West Africa may have to East Africa, specifically the land of Kemet, which most of us know by its Greek name, Egypt.
Here you have the Nsibidi script on your right, and then you have the Egyptian script on the left. Look at the similarities. Look at them. Comparison between the Egyptian script and the Toma signs. Look at the similarities. See, when you look at stuff like this, then it becomes very hard for people to tell you that, well, Egypt was isolated. Egypt was not a part of Africa. The Mende signs. This is Vi. The moon. You know, what's so interesting, some of them are identical.
As we have explained in earlier segments of this series, the original people to live in Kemet didn't look like the residents there today. The faces of the pharaohs, their own written description of themselves as black people of the black land, and extensive research by scholars such as Dr. Asa Hilliard means the people we show you now may have had their descendants brought to the Americas as slaves. By now it's fairly obvious you can't talk about African American culture without having accurate facts about African history. But it gets hard to talk about contributions if no one knows what they are.
Have you ever studied Africa?
No.
No. Not at all?
No. No. But I have studied Switzerland.
Have you studied China?
No.
Have you studied Mexico?
Few Americans, black or white, realized the African continent had thriving city-states, trade routes, governments, and kingdoms before the Europeans came.
But information does exist which helps us understand African continuity with African American continuity. Books such as this by Richard Hall. In African Cities and Towns Before the European Conquest, Hall gives us pictures, documentation, and more specifically, information about African lifestyles, some of those habits and pieces of culture we see in African Americans today.
Salaga, Gayo, Segu, all large pre-European African towns. Some grew on the banks of the Niger River. Others supported populations of about 400,000, and this according to European accounts. West African market cities such as Janneh and Gayo were wealthy and prosperous, with residents buying and selling gold in 1596. Two of these towns were probably founded somewhere around 822 to 921 AD. Travelers from Europe and other places describe the inhabitants as exceedingly rich, and the cities stood as homes for many doctors, judges, priests, and learned men. This type of praise also denotes a high standard of learning during what we call Europeans' Dark Ages.
When Europe was having its Dark Ages, there were no Dark Ages in the rest of the world. Africans was having an age of enlightenment, the Chinese were having an age of enlightenment, and the people of India was having an age of enlightenment. We have a tendency to take European terminology and stretch it across the whole world. But there were no comparable Dark Ages in the rest of the world until the European came.
Okay.
The European came out of his Dark Age and created a Dark Age for the rest of the world by the destruction of their civilization.
Again, accurate research supports these claims. Internationally respected author and African scholar Dr. Ivan van Sertima says, for centuries, Africans surpassed Europeans in many areas. He says as late as the 1800s, Europeans came to the Africans to learn advanced techniques in science, medicine, and antibiotics.
They also observed the cleanness with which they cut the abdomen. They observed how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They observed how they stitched. They observed also that the African surgeons with consummate skill used the cautery iron in such a way that they could stop internal bleeding during the operation almost instantly with minor tissue damage using the hot irons. And all this was brought back. It was described in great detail. It was drawn and brought back into Europe.
Again, give me the year and give me the civilization that used these advanced medical techniques.
This was observed by a team that went out towards the end of the 1870s. It's somewhere around 1878 that it was published in the Edinburgh Medical Journal. It was on the team Dr. Felkin from Britain and Scotland, a joint British-Scottish team. It was observed among the Banyuro.
Now, at the beginning of this program, we defined culture as whatever you can learn. Using that definition, the ancient Africans were a very cultured people before the Europeans came. Learning and libraries held a great deal of importance to these people.
There were books, formal books, parchment, papyrus books, thousands of them along the Nile in the temples. At Timbuktu, you had formal books, bound books like we know books to be.
But how did all of this information get lost, and why did it happen? Psychologist Naeem Akbar offers this explanation.
We came to America as a free people. In order for us to become slaves, it was necessary to destroy our consciousness of ourselves as independent human beings. That process was one by which you begin to destroy and to degrade those things which give you your sense of identity, purpose, direction, and origin. And in the process of doing so, you create a slave mind rather than a freed mind. And a constant onslaught of misinformation about who the slaves were was done intentionally for the purpose of making the slaves submissive and subject to the leadership of those authorities over them.
Much of Africa's history is wrapped around the glory of her kings, from the kingdoms of Kemet to the majesty of Mali and Songhai. African history developed around documented men and women. It's a comment about the power of racism and Western education that we rarely hear about these people or their countries. Who were some of these kings and queens? Dr. John Henrik Clark is a living library of resources in this area.
We know that Ghana lasted until 1000s. In the last of its many great kings, Tenkameni was killed 2 years before the Muslim invasion, 1076. So that means Tenkameni lasted until 1074. He was known as the king who rode out every day, twice a day. He would ride out and administer justice one part of the day. And no one had to move from his presence until he was satisfied that justice had been done in his case. He would ride out at the end of the day with dogs with gold collars, horses better dressed than the then kings of Europe, in splendid regalia.
At this point, we should let you know a little about the geography of ancient Africa. Ghana didn't have the boundaries it has today. In fact, according to Dr. Clark, none of present-day Ghana was a part of ancient Ghana. Dr. Clark says the boundaries of ancient Ghana look something like this. Again, we need to realize these kingdoms governed millions of people and had wealth. Wealth usually denotes commerce. Dr. Rosalind Jeffrey says the ancient Africans may have come up with the world's first calculator system to handle their daily transactions.
The old system in the marketplace was to put these little digits in a pan, and you would have your client come to you buying, purchasing perhaps little groupings of materials, a dozen of this or 2 dozen, etc. And meanwhile, someone takes away a dozen and this, that, and the other. Meanwhile, you're moving your disc around in a pan or in a basket. And so as you're moving around, they become your way of counting. So that modern society, we have our little hand calculator, right, with a little battery inside. And the old days, you know, ancient Mali, Ghana, Songhai, etc., they had a little basket where they were shuffling around little metal discs and at the same time, you know, doing their calculations this way.
As all worldly kingdoms do, Ghana began to decline. But as that happened, the neighboring country of Mali began to rise. Dr. Clark says Mali produced some of the greatest kings in world history.
After Sunde Atta, there was a servant king, Sakuru. And after Sakuru, the greatest of all the kings of Mali, Mansa Musa. And he came to power in 1306. In 1324, he went on a famous journey to Mecca and Medina because he was a Muslim. He spent all those years preparing. He took with him from 60 to 100,000 people, 50 hairdressers, and he only had his favorite wives.
How many of them?
Only the favorite wives went on the trip. They had 50 hairdressers.
Oh,
so you can guess how many wives were there. Now you talking about style. Now when we had it, baby.
Okay, so he left basically from northern Central Africa, is that correct?
Yes.
And then went all the way into Mecca.
Went to Egypt. Went to Egypt first. Where he was crowned the great caliph of the Western Sudan. I mean, it's equivalent to Pope.
Right.
Then he went over to Mecca and Medina to pay his respects and gave alms and food and, you know, in fact, he took with him 250 camels, each with 250 pounds of gold each.
To give away?
To give away. And when he got back to Egypt, he was a little short of gold, and they put the entire treasure at his disposal. So you good for it. Take what you need.
Oh, man.
This is just for the trip home.
Did he marry into cities along the way?
He married his people, 50 of his people, into cities along the way, on his way. And on his way back, he said, we should not fight now because we're relatives. So it was a mission of peace. Now, this is no ordinary king. So no ordinary homecoming present is good for him. So while he was away, his local army captured the neighboring country.
Which was?
Sangay. And gave him the country as a homecoming present.
That's amazing.
Now Timbuktu is under his control.
Which means the great libraries.
Not only the library of Timbuktu, but the great mosque at Sankore that he's going to turn into the University of Sankore.
And all of this is done by Africans, not Arabs.
No Arabs in sight.
We had African scholars. And once again, it's important to know the history because at this time, Islam had taken a stronghold particularly in parts of West Africa. So you had African scholars who had Arabic names in much the same way that we have European names. It doesn't mean we're not black, that we're not of African descent because we have European names. There are reasons why we have European names. But when we look into the history and we see somebody called Ahmed Baba, don't automatically assume that Ahmed Baba looks like the Egyptians that are in Egypt today. Ahmed Baba looked like you. Okay? We need to understand that.
Ms. Harris said it's important for school children to know about educated Africans such as Ahmed Baba. She also says it's important to remember that people such as Baba had their books destroyed.
They destroyed libraries. Ahmed Baba had a library, a personal library, that had over 1,600 books. It was destroyed.
Probably one of the saddest things about the loss of African culture is that many Africans don't even recognize things that are part of their history.
Dr. Rosalind Jeffries says the ancient Africans carried these containers filled with writings and sayings. They were scriptures and parables important to them. So you could say they quite literally carried the written word on their hearts. Dr. Jeffries' research has uncovered slave diaries. These books were discounted as memorization or pre-written Arabic script, but they're not. It's also not uncommon to find another obvious vestige of Black America's often overlooked African heritage, the call and response.
Call and response is a freedom of speech in its purest form. Every amen, each, teach now, sister, take your time. Every one of those right-ons, even the negative shake of the head, and if no more than the lift of that hand that goes back and forth, register that the response is there. Each response shapes and colors the call. This is a process that empowers all of us. And I'm going to tell you something. It's far less expensive than opinion polls. Now, you may have noticed that in certain settings, the dynamics of call and response is overlooked or misinterpreted. For example, white American moviegoers have been known to complain that the Bloods talk back to the movie screen. We sure do. even after centuries of an aborted attempt to assimilate all that is our culture, after centuries of misinformation, we African Americans still respond to the right calls.
The more accurate information gathered, the more likely it becomes to see cultural continuity for all African peoples. Unity in traditional black church services, where the call and response of songs echo back to the praise and response shouted before great African kings as they moved among their people.
I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad. All right, you got, let's do it now. We were in a strange land. We had been snatched from our homeland, raped of our culture, cut off from all that was familiar to us. But down there in the canebrake in the brush arbor, we continued to sing and moan and chant for freedom on the rhythm forms and musical idioms that were familiar to us from Mother Africa. Once we were introduced to this new language, we developed what has been called the pidgin English of the slaves. And on those rhythm forms and musical idioms, after being introduced to this Jesus person, we developed that baseline music art form called the African American spiritual. That old time religion, on Monday I got that old time religion. I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad.
It's easy to show you comparisons of African cultural continuity in speech and writing and music. It's harder to compare social continuity in African American culture, but it does exist. Following some of the theories he gave us at the beginning of the program, Dr. Wade Nobles says many actions and gestures blacks take for granted actually show cultural continuity. Nobles also says that when a black woman puts her hand on her hip, she makes a gesture of righteousness that may date back to African culture as it was 5,000 years ago.
And we understand that that's intent that we can see in the grammar of our behavior. Isn't it interesting that this sign is the Mason Square? And in ancient Kemet, in the hieroglyphs, this sign represented righteousness. And so when sister puts her hand on her hip, she ain't just saying, I got big hips and I can rest it here, even though that is true. She, in fact, is saying that there's a question of you being correct. You understand? And when she puts both hands on her hips, she's saying, you doubly incorrect. You see? And so all we can say is, hey, I'm sorry. That's the sign. That's beginning to read and understand the intent of content. The content is the hands.
Africans are the only group of people who had to hide their heritage and who had the dominant society spend centuries trying to destroy that heritage. While some of that destruction did strip away surface ties, we hope the information presented in this half hour allows you to see all African culture did not die.
We know that African Americans, or African people, when they were brought to America, they weren't allowed to bring their cultural artifacts. They weren't allowed to bring the drum. They weren't allowed to bring the clothing. They weren't allowed to bring many things. But what they did bring, they were able to carry it in their minds and in their hearts. They were able to carry the rhythms. They were able to bring the stories. They were able to bring the patterns of speech. All of this we carried with us. And many people would like us to believe that once we were herded onto slave ships, that we left that on the seashore, on the shores of Africa. And that is so untrue. And when we look around us every day, we see remnants of our culture.
Earlier we showed you examples of Egyptian hieroglyphics and showed you similarities seen in West African scripts. These scripts suggest that African peoples may have migrated from the east to the west of the continent and beyond. We'll discuss those migrations and explain why they occurred in the next edition of African American Culture, A Second Look.
I ask you, my children, what did you learn today? Did anyone tell you how to meet tomorrow? Did anyone tell you why there are people who don't know you? Did anyone seem to know who you were? Did anyone know